The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the scent of snow and secrets. On the edge of Red Willow stood a woman who had lost everything but her dignity, and a man who had forgotten what it meant to belong. When their paths crossed one stormy night, neither imagined that a single knock on a wooden door would change both their lives forever. In a town ruled by judgment and silence, love would demand courage, truth, and a heart willing to risk it all. If you love emotional, dramatic historical romances, subscribe now and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing these timeless love stories to life. Red Willow, Wyoming Territory. Winter of 1879. The wind came down from the hills with the slow determination of something ancient, rattling shutters, scattering dry snow across the frozen road and pressing its hand against every door. At the very edge of town, where the noise of the saloon faded into the whistling of the plains, stood a narrow wooden house with pale curtains and a chimney that never stopped breathing smoke. Inside, Margaret Doyle moved through her boarding house as though through a fragile world she alone could keep from falling apart. She wore a wool dress the color of storm clouds. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her fingers raw from the washboard. Every corner smelled faintly of soap, bread, and survival. On the table lay a small stack of unpaid notes, carefully arranged beneath a chipped porcelain lamp. Her daughter, Elsie, played near the stove with a piece of twine and a worn-out doll, singing softly to herself. The child's laughter rose like a stubborn melody against the cold, but Margaret's gaze was heavy, fixed on the window pane glazed with frost. She whispered to herself, not quite prayer, not quite defiance. "I'll keep us warm, little one. I'll keep us safe." A knock came at the door, 3 slow, deliberate raps that sounded nothing like the restless chatter of the townfolk. Margaret hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart tightening with the reflexive caution of a woman too long acquainted with disappointment. When she opened the door, a gust of snow entered first, followed by a tall man in a dark coat dusted with white. His hat shadowed his face, but she noticed the square line of his jaw and the kind of quiet that did not come from shyness but from habit. "Mrs. Doyle?" His voice was low, the tone of a man who spoke little but meant what he said. "I was told you had a room." For a moment she simply looked at him, her breath visible in the cold. His eyes, grey, serious, unreadable, met hers, and she felt an unfamiliar shiver that had nothing to do with the winter air. "I have 1 room left," she replied, tightening her shawl. "It's plain, but it's clean. Payment is weekly in advance." He nodded once, then stepped inside. The door closed, shutting out the storm, but not the strange stillness that followed. The man set down his saddlebags, removed his hat, and looked around the modest room. The narrow stairs, the faded rug, the smell of firewood. "That will do," he said simply, reaching into his coat for a small leather pouch. He placed the coins on the table with deliberate precision. "Name's Samuel Crowe. I'll trouble you for as little time as I can." "You'll find there's little trouble to be had here," Margaret said, counting the coins, though her hands trembled slightly. Samuel inclined his head, then turned to glance at Elsie. The little girl, fearless in her curiosity, stared back at him with wide green eyes. "Mamma, is he going to stay for supper?" "Mind your manners, Elsie," Margaret murmured, though her cheeks warmed at the innocence of the question. Samuel smiled faintly, the expression fleeting but real. "Only if there's enough for 3, he said. There was not enough, but she would make it do. She always did. As twilight deepened, the small house filled with the scent of broth and wood smoke. Samuel sat quietly at the table, removing his gloves with the precision of someone who had learned restraint too early. Margaret served him, without looking too long, though her eyes were drawn again and again to the roughness of his hands, the silence between his words. "You're not from Red Willow," she said finally. "No, ma'am. I keep a small ranch south of here. Came to settle some accounts before the weather turns." She nodded, stirring her soup. "Ranching must be lonely work." He lifted his gaze to hers. "It's honest work. Loneliness comes free with it." Something in the way he said it, a quiet acceptance rather than complaint, moved her unexpectedly. For a heartbeat, she wanted to tell him that loneliness came free with nearly everything in her life too, but she said nothing. Later, when the dishes were washed and Elsie had fallen asleep by the fire, Margaret found Samuel standing near the window, watching the snow drift in the moonlight. The lamplight brushed the edges of his face. Strong lines, tired eyes, a man carved by wind and silence. "You'll freeze looking out there," she said softly. He turned slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting in the ghost of a smile. "I've seen worse nights, but this one feels quieter." "Quieter can be dangerous," she replied. "Or peaceful," he murmured. "Depends who's listening." Margaret felt the warmth of the fire on her back, the cold draft at her feet, and the weight of his words somewhere in between. She folded her arms, unsure whether to thank him or send him away from the window, away from the strange calm that unsettled her. When she finally spoke, her voice had softened. "You'll find peace hard to come by in Red Willow, Mr. Crowe. People here remember everything that isn't their business." "I don't mind talk," he said. "Talk dies faster than winter grass." For the first time that evening she smiled, tired but genuine. "Then perhaps you'll fit right in." He looked at her, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, restraint, maybe the faintest glimmer of need. The firelight caught the gold in her hair and the fatigue in her eyes, and Samuel found himself wanting to stay, though he had come with no intention of belonging anywhere. When he retired to his room, the house seemed too quiet again. Margaret stood by the door, listening to the wind, to the creak of floorboards overhead, to the rhythmic breath of her sleeping child. She pressed a hand to her chest and felt her heart beating like a secret she could not yet name. Outside, snow continued to fall, steady and soft, erasing tracks, silencing noise, and wrapping Red Willow in the hush of things about to begin. The sun rose pale over Red Willow. Its light filtered through a thin veil of frost that clung to every window pane and fence post. The storm had passed, but the cold that followed was sharper than ever, cutting through coats and gloves, biting at faces like a silent warning that winter ruled here, not man. In the small boarding house at the edge of town, the morning began with the soft rhythm of survival. Margaret Doyle moved quietly through her kitchen, the sleeves of her wool dress rolled up, her hair pinned hastily as she stoked the fire. The scent of coffee mingled with wood smoke, filling the narrow room with the warmth of routine. She spoke little, though her thoughts ran deep. Numbers, supplies, wood to be chopped, debts to be paid. Everything, as always, depended on her hands. Samuel Crowe was already awake. She found him outside the back door, splitting logs with the ease of someone who had worked the land his whole life. The first light of dawn painted his breath in silver clouds. His coat hung open despite the cold, his movements calm and sure. When he noticed her at the doorway, he paused and nodded once, his grey eyes unreadable. "You don't have to do that," she said, stepping out carefully into the snow. "You're paying for a room, not for labour." "I don't like sitting still," he answered, setting another log onto the stump. "Besides, I'd rather earn my breakfast than wait for it." Margaret pressed her shawl tighter around her shoulders. There was something unsettling about his quiet courtesy, about a man who offered help without expectation. She was used to men who wanted something for every kindness. Samuel's silence felt too clean, too unspoken to be trusted easily. "I hope you're not trying to impress me, Mr. Crowe," she said, forcing a lightness she didn't feel. He lifted the axe again, the motion fluid, his tone measured. "No, ma'am. I gave up trying to impress people a long time ago." His words lingered longer than they should have. Margaret stood there a moment more, watching as the wood split under his steady hand, each blow echoing across the empty fields. Something about that rhythm felt strangely comforting, like a heartbeat she hadn't realized she'd been listening for. By the time she set breakfast on the table, eggs, cornbread, and thin slices of ham, the rest of the boarders had come and gone to their day's errands. Only Samuel remained, his posture straight, his hat resting neatly beside his plate. Elsie sat across from him, chattering as children do, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "Do you have horses, Mr. Crowe?" she asked between bites of cornbread. "Two," he replied. "A grey mare and a chestnut. They work harder than most men I've met." Margaret glanced at him sharply. "And you treat them better, I imagine." He looked at her then, and for a heartbeat there was warmth behind his cool exterior. "I treat what I need to keep alive with care, Mrs. Doyle." Her breath caught for reasons she didn't care to name. The table felt suddenly too small, the air too close. She focused on her cup instead, tracing the crack in its porcelain rim. After breakfast, Samuel pulled on his gloves and prepared to ride into town. "Need anything brought back?" he asked from the doorway. Margaret hesitated. "Flour, if you pass by the store. I'll pay you when you return." He nodded. "I'll keep a list." Elsie ran to the window as he mounted his horse, her small hands pressed to the glass. "He looks like he belongs out there," she said softly. Margaret folded her dish towel, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I suppose he does." When Samuel's figure disappeared into the distance, she turned back to her chores. Yet the silence he left behind lingered, curling through the room like the scent of smoke after the fire has died. Later that morning, she walked into town herself. The main street of Red Willow was lined with simple buildings, general store, livery stable, church, and the saloon, whose laughter could be heard even in daylight. The snow had been cleared unevenly, leaving muddy tracks in the road. Margaret kept her head high and her hands tucked under her shawl. She had learned long ago that the only armor a woman could afford was dignity. Inside the store, the air smelled of coffee beans and wool. Beatrice Harlan, the merchant's wife, was already there, her dark cape trimmed in fur, her gloved hands resting delicately on the counter. She turned the moment Margaret entered, her smile sharp and thin. "Mrs. Doyle," Beatrice greeted, her tone sweet as spoiled milk. "Still keeping that establishment of yours open, I see." It's a boarding house," Margaret replied evenly. "Honest work, as you well know." Beatrice's eyes flickered with mock pity. "Of course, and I hear you've taken in a new lodger. A man alone, no less. The town does love to talk." Margaret's stomach tightened, but she forced her expression to remain calm. "People will talk no matter what I do. I'd rather they speak of a full house than an empty table." Beatrice leaned in slightly, her perfume cloying. "Careful, dear. Appearances are delicate things. One can ruin them without meaning to." Margaret turned away, placing her coins firmly on the counter. "Then perhaps it's best I stop caring who thinks I'm worth saving." As she left the store, she saw Samuel across the street, speaking quietly to the blacksmith. His breath rose in clouds against the pale morning light, and when he turned and caught sight of her, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. That single wordless gesture undid the weight Beatrice's words had left behind. Margaret inclined her head in return, then continued down the street, feeling a strange steadiness she hadn't felt in years. That evening, as the wind picked up again, Samuel returned with supplies and a faint scent of tobacco and cold air clinging to him. "Got your flour," he said simply, setting the sack by the door. "Thank you," she replied. "You didn't have to carry it all this way yourself." "Didn't trust the boy at the store to tie it right. Thought I'd save you a spill." Margaret smiled faintly. "You seem to think I need saving often." His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "I think you've been doing all the saving alone for too long." She felt her breath hitch, the fire crackling beside them, the only sound between their words. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Maybe not," he said softly, "but I know the look of someone who's forgotten what it's like to be helped." For a long moment neither moved. The air between them shimmered with something fragile, something neither dared name. Then Elsie came running in, breaking the spell, her laughter scattering the silence like pebbles on water. "Mr. Crowe, look!" she cried, holding up a drawing of a horse and rider. "It's you!" Samuel crouched down to her level, studying the uneven lines and smudged pencil. "You've made me taller than I am," he said. "Because you look tall when you ride," she replied confidently. He smiled then, a small, unguarded thing that softened his entire face. Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart folding in on itself. There was a tenderness in him that the world had not yet managed to break. After supper, the other boarders retired early, leaving the house quiet. Margaret sat by the fire with her mending, her needle moving steadily through a torn sleeve. Samuel sat nearby, sharpening a small knife with patient rhythm. The crackle of the logs filled the silence. "Mrs. Doyle," he said after a while, his tone hesitant, "I don't mean to pry, but I heard what that woman said to you this morning." Margaret's hands paused. "You were at the store." "Outside," he admitted. "Didn't mean to overhear." She resumed sewing, her expression composed. "Then you heard nothing worth remembering." He leaned forward, his voice lower. "She was wrong, you know." Margaret met his eyes then, the lamplight catching in her lashes. "They always are, but it doesn't stop them from speaking." Samuel studied her for a long moment. "You shouldn't have to fight the whole town alone." Her tone softened, almost a whisper. "And what would you have me do? Ask a man to defend me? That only gives them more to whisper about." He looked down at his hands, at the knife gleaming in the firelight. "Maybe you don't need defending. But sometimes people like that need reminding they're not as righteous as they think." "Violence won't silence gossip," she said quietly. "I wasn't talking about violence," he murmured. "A man can stand beside someone without drawing his gun." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks upward. Margaret's throat tightened. "And why would you stand beside me, Mr. Crowe?" He hesitated, his voice barely audible. "Because I know what it is to be alone in a room full of people, pretending not to see you." Her needle slipped from her fingers. She turned her face away, afraid of the way her heart responded to those simple words. The silence that followed was not cold. It was thick, alive, filled with the pulse of something awakening. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with the effort of keeping steady. "You speak like a man who's lost too much." Samuel's eyes darkened. "Maybe I have. But some losses teach a man how to notice what others take for granted." Margaret looked up, meeting his gaze again. The distance between them seemed smaller now, measured not in steps, but in breaths. "And what have you noticed here?" He studied her face. The curve of her cheek, the strength in her eyes, the softness that survived despite the years. "That you keep a fire burning in this house even when there's hardly enough wood to feed it. That you wear your pride like armor. And that your kindness scares you." Her breath caught. "You assume too much." "Maybe," he said, his tone rough but gentle. "But I'd rather assume kindness than believe it doesn't exist." Margaret felt the room shift around them, the shadows deepening as the fire burned lower. Her pulse quickened. She rose to fetch another log, needing movement, distance, air. But Samuel stood too, taking the log from her hands. Their fingers brushed, brief, electric. "Thank you," she whispered. His voice was low, steady. "You don't have to thank me for that." When he placed the log onto the fire, the flame flared and filled the room with golden light. It illuminated their faces, two souls weathered by the same cold, standing within arm's reach yet bound by the invisible threads of caution and yearning. Outside, the wind began to rise again, brushing against the windows like a restless spirit. Inside, the boarding house seemed warmer than it had in years. Margaret returned to her chair, but her thoughts no longer belonged to her alone. She watched the fire and listened to the soft scrape of Samuel's boots on the floor, the quiet weight of his presence behind her. That night, long after she had blown out the lamp, she lay awake, listening to the wind and to the faint creak of floorboards overhead. The world outside was unforgiving, but somewhere in the room above, a man who spoke little and felt deeply was breathing under the same roof. And for the first time in many winters, Margaret Doyle allowed herself to hope that perhaps this house, this small, fragile home built on courage and endurance, might hold more than survival. It might, one day, hold warmth. The morning dawned heavy with mist, the kind that wrapped itself around Red Willow like a secret no one wished to tell. The streets were quiet, still frozen from the night's frost, and the sound of the blacksmith's hammer carried faintly through the cold air. Inside the boarding house, Margaret Doyle stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass, watching the pale light of day creep slowly across the snow. The world was quiet, too quiet, and she felt that familiar ache, the one that came from trying too hard to appear strong when she was simply tired. From the back of the house came the steady thud of an axe. Samuel Crowe had returned early that morning from the livery, without announcement or sound. When Margaret found him splitting wood once more, his coat half open to the cold, she wanted to protest, but something in his calm, deliberate movement stopped her. His expression was as steady as the swing of his arm, a man carving order out of silence. "Mr. Crowe," she called, stepping out into the morning chill. "You'll work yourself sick if you keep that pace." He paused, leaning on the axe handle. "I've been working since before sunrise, Mrs. Doyle. Haven't managed to die from it yet." The faintest smile touched her lips. "That doesn't mean it can't happen." He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them, that quiet awareness of two souls equally accustomed to loss. He tipped his hat slightly, his voice lower now. "Then I'll take my chances. Hard work's the only thing that keeps a man from thinking too much." Margaret folded her arms around herself. "And what is it you'd rather not think about, Mr. Crowe?" The question lingered, suspended between them like breath in the cold. Samuel's eyes flickered toward the horizon, toward the line of hills blanketed in snow. "That some things can't be mended no matter how many times you try." She could have asked more, but the gravity in his tone warned her not to. There were wounds inside that voice, and she wasn't sure if she wished to know them or to forget her curiosity entirely. Instead, she gestured toward the doorway. "There's coffee on the stove. You can take a cup before you freeze." He nodded once, quietly grateful, and followed her inside. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cornbread, of small mercies and weary mornings. Margaret poured 2 cups, her hands steady, despite the faint tremor of nerves that came whenever he stood too close. He had that presence, the kind that filled a room even when he said nothing. She set 1 cup on the table. "You never rest," she said, sitting across from him. "Do you ever stop working?" He studied the steam rising from his cup. "Work's the only thing that makes sense. Talking doesn't fix fences or feed cattle, but it keeps the heart alive," she murmured, almost to herself. He looked up then, eyes like the color of smoke. "Hearts don't need keeping. They beat whether you want them to or not." Margaret felt her pulse quicken, though she masked it with a faint, tight smile. "You speak as if you'd rather yours didn't." Samuel didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, his hands wrapped around the cup, the lines on his face deepened by the low light. "Sometimes I think it'd be easier that way." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, and from the next room, Elsie's small voice could be heard singing to her doll. Margaret's heart tightened at the sound, innocence thriving where exhaustion ruled. She rose to check the stove, needing something to do, something to look at other than the man across from her, whose quiet sadness pulled at her more than she cared to admit. "You'll find this town isn't much kinder to people who keep to themselves," she said, her tone light but edged with truth. "They'll wonder why you stay. They'll invent their own stories before asking for the real one." "I'm used to that," he replied. "People prefer their own version of a man to the truth of him." "Then you'll fit right in," she said, turning back with a hint of irony. His gaze softened. "And you? Do you care what they say about you, Mrs. Doyle?" She stiffened slightly. "I learned long ago that caring doesn't change their words." "It doesn't," he agreed quietly, "but it changes the way you live." Margaret wanted to argue, but she couldn't. The truth in his voice left no room for deflection. She only looked at him, this man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of winter itself, and felt an unfamiliar heat spread through her chest. Before she could speak again, a knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, the morning's peace shattered. Standing there was Beatrice Harlan, wrapped in her dark fur-lined cape, her expression sharp with curiosity and judgment. "Good morning, Mrs. Doyle," she said, her tone polite but poisoned. "I came to see if you'd still be attending the church supper this week. The Reverend says every good Christian woman ought to show her face now and then." "I'll consider it," Margaret replied curtly, "though I imagine some faces are more welcome than others." Beatrice gave a brittle laugh. "Oh, don't be so modest. I hear you've taken in new company. The whole town's been wondering about your generosity." Her eyes darted past Margaret's shoulder, catching sight of Samuel standing quietly by the hearth. Beatrice's brows rose. "So, the rumors are true. A rancher, is he? Well, at least it's not another drifter." Margaret's cheeks flushed, her anger rising like fire beneath her composure. "Mr. Crowe is a paying lodger and nothing more." Beatrice smiled thinly. "Of course, dear. That's how it always begins." Samuel's voice came from behind Margaret, steady but cold. "Ma'am, I don't know you, and I don't care for gossip. If you've come to insult your neighbors, you'd best take it outside before the coffee gets cold." Beatrice's mouth tightened. "You must be new to Red Willow, Mr. Crowe. People here remember everything. I'd advise you to watch the company you keep." Samuel's tone dropped lower, not loud but enough to make her falter. "Then they do well to remember how to mind their manners." The air thickened between them, until Beatrice, flustered and red-faced, turned sharply on her heel. The sound of her boots faded down the snowy road. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, the adrenaline in her chest still burning. She turned to him, eyes wide. "You shouldn't have done that." He shrugged, setting his cup down with deliberate calm. "Shouldn't have, maybe, but it needed saying. She'll make sure the whole town hears about this by sundown." She would have done that anyway," he said simply. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her temple. "You don't understand how things work here. A woman like Beatrice doesn't fight fair. She poisons quietly, and she never forgets." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "You've been fighting alone for too long, Mrs. Doyle." The words undid her. She sat down, the strength leaving her shoulders. "And what choice do I have? I've learned that the moment you depend on someone, they leave, every time." He knelt beside her chair, his voice rough with something like pain. "Maybe you've been depending on the wrong kind of people." Margaret turned her face away, afraid he might see the tears that threatened. "Don't speak as if you know my life." "No," he said, his voice gentler now, "but I know what it feels like to lose it." That silenced her. For the first time, she dared to meet his gaze fully. What she saw there was not pity, but understanding so deep it frightened her. "What was her name?" she asked softly. Samuel hesitated. "My wife's name was Eleanor." The sound of it hung in the air like a prayer. He spoke the name as if he had not in years, as if speaking it now was both an act of pain and remembrance. "She died?" Margaret asked carefully. He nodded once. 3 winters ago. The cold took her before the dawn did." His eyes dropped to his hands. "Since then I keep busy. Easier to chase the next sunrise than remember the last one." Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." He smiled faintly, a sad, crooked smile. "Don't be. She was better than this place. Better than me. She deserved more than an empty house and a husband who couldn't save her." The confession cut through the air with raw honesty. Margaret wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to offer something, anything, but her courage failed her. Instead, she whispered, "No one deserves to be alone in grief." Samuel's eyes lifted to hers. "Then why do you look like you've made peace with it?" She laughed softly, without humor. "Peace? I've made peace with nothing. I just learned to stop expecting the world to give me back what it took." Their eyes met, and for a moment the room seemed smaller, the silence between them deeper than sound. There was nothing grand in that moment, no touch, no promise, but something within both of them shifted quietly, a slow turning of hearts long sealed. Elsie's voice broke the stillness. "Mamma! Look, it's snowing again!" Margaret rose quickly, moving to the window with her daughter. Outside, flakes began to fall, soft, slow, endless. Samuel watched them both, the way the lamplight haloed their figures, and something inside him eased for the first time in years. When Margaret turned back, her expression was gentle, though her voice trembled. "Thank you for speaking up today, even if you shouldn't have." He inclined his head. Any man with sense would have done the same. "No," she said quietly. "Most men would have looked away." He hesitated, then said, "I've looked away too often in my life. It doesn't help anyone." The weight of his words lingered long after the fire burned low. Later that evening, when the lamps were dimmed and the snow had settled thick upon the rooftops, Margaret found herself standing once more at the window, her fingers resting against the glass. Somewhere beyond that cold and endless white, a man who worked to outrun his ghosts had chosen to stay, at least for now, and though she told herself it meant nothing, her heart whispered otherwise. In the house that had long been silent except for the wind and her child's laughter, there was, at last, another kind of sound, a quiet, living warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The first week of December fell over Red Willow like a slow-moving dream, pale and relentless. The days were shorter now, the mornings carved in ice, and every rooftop shimmered under a thin crust of frost that refused to melt. The air smelled of pine smoke and iron, and even the sound of horse hooves on the frozen road seemed to echo longer than before. In Margaret Doyle's boarding house, the hearth never slept. She had learned to keep the fire alive through every night, feeding it with the same quiet determination that she gave to everything else in her life. The warmth never quite reached the corners of the room, but it kept her daughter safe and her pride intact. That, for her, was enough. But this winter, something had shifted. The silence of the house was different now. It carried another kind of breath, the deep, patient stillness of a man who moved through her days like a shadow she was learning not to fear. Samuel Crowe had been staying for nearly 2 weeks, and in that time his presence had settled into her world as naturally as the snow outside. He rose before dawn, worked with steady purpose, and spoke only when words were necessary. Yet his silence was not the kind that weighed heavy. It was a silence that steadied the air, that filled the spaces between them with something dangerously close to comfort. That morning, Margaret stood by the window, mending a tear in one of Elsie's dresses. The child hummed near the fire, stitching her own small patchwork doll with hands clumsy but determined. Outside, Samuel was repairing the fence that bordered the back of the property. She could see him through the frost-flecked glass, the line of his shoulders, the tilt of his hat against the wind, the precision of his movements. The world beyond him was still and pale, and for a fleeting second she thought he looked like a figure drawn out of the land itself, weathered and unyielding. She caught herself watching too long and quickly turned away, scolding the small flutter that rose in her chest. "Elsie," she said, her voice steady, "fetch me the blue thread, will you?" The little girl stood, smiling. "The one you use for your Sunday dress?" "Yes, that one." As Elsie crossed the room, a sudden gust of wind pushed through the doorframe, scattering ashes in the hearth. Margaret sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "This house has more cracks than promises," she murmured. A familiar voice answered from behind her. "Cracks can be mended if someone takes the time." She turned to find Samuel standing in the doorway, his hat in hand, his coat dusted with snow. The chill clung to him, turning the air around him sharper, cleaner. "I thought you were still outside," she said. "I was," he replied, setting his hat on the peg. "Fence is mended, for now." "For now?" He shrugged slightly, his expression unreadable. "Winter tests everything that looks strong." There was something in the way he said it that made her look away. She busied herself with the kettle, though her pulse betrayed her calm. "You're a man of metaphors, Mr. Crowe." "I'm a man who's seen things break," he said quietly. The kettle began to hum, filling the silence that followed. Margaret poured 2 cups of tea and set one before him. Their hands brushed as she passed the cup, and the faintest warmth from his skin lingered on her fingertips. Elsie, unaware of the charged stillness between the adults, looked up with her usual brightness. "Mr. Crowe, will you be at the Christmas fair?" Samuel blinked, startled by the question. "I didn't know there was one." "There's always one," Elsie said proudly. "The Reverend says even if we can't afford ribbons, we can still have joy." Margaret smiled faintly. "The fair's small, but the church holds it every year. There's music, food, a tree in the square. The whole town turns out to pretend the world isn't as hard as it is." "Will you go?" he asked her. Her smile faded. "I haven't gone in years." "Why not?" "Because pretending is harder than staying home." For a long moment he said nothing, then softly, "Maybe it's not pretending. Maybe it's remembering what used to feel real." She met his eyes then, steady, grey, sincere, and for one reckless second she wished she could believe him, but belief, like joy, was a luxury she couldn't afford. That afternoon, Margaret walked into town to deliver mended shirts to the general store. The streets were busier than usual. Men carried lumber for decorations, and women spoke in clusters, their voices rising in bursts of laughter that sounded like brittle glass. Red ribbons fluttered on lampposts. Children dragged sleds down the slope near the livery, their laughter echoing against the frozen buildings. It might have been beautiful, if not for the eyes that followed her, the familiar glances that never softened, the smiles that barely hid their judgment. She had long learned to walk through them with her chin raised, her pace unbroken, but this time she noticed whispers as she passed. "The widow who isn't one. The rancher's new friend. She's playing dangerous games." When she reached the store, Otis Whitaker greeted her with a warm nod. "Mrs. Doyle, the shirts look fine as ever. You've got the steadiest hand in town." "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," she said, grateful for his kindness. "That will cover this month's credit, I hope." "It will," he said softly, then lowering his voice, "Pay no mind to what folks say. They talk because they're cold and bored." Margaret forced a smile. "I've grown used to the sound of my name in other people's mouths." Still, as she left, the unease followed her like a shadow. At dusk, snow began to fall again, thick and quiet. The road home stretched long and white beneath the fading light. As she neared the house, she saw Samuel waiting by the gate, the glow from the lantern casting amber light across his face. "I thought you might be late," he said. "Wasn't sure the path would hold with all this snow." She stopped a few steps away. "You were waiting for me?" He hesitated, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Maybe I was waiting to make sure you didn't need rescuing." Her voice softened, caught somewhere between irritation and gratitude. "I don't make a habit of needing rescuing, Mr. Crowe." "I've noticed," he said, "but habits can change." The wind carried their breath between them, visible and fleeting. The sound of the snow beneath their boots was the only proof that time hadn't stopped. "People are talking again," she said quietly. "You should know that." "I figured as much," he replied. "You worried?" "I'm used to being the target of gossip, but I don't like dragging others into it. I can handle a few whispers." "You say that now," she said, her tone trembling slightly, "but this town doesn't forgive easily." Samuel's eyes softened. "I'm not asking for its forgiveness, only your company at supper." The simplicity of the offer disarmed her. "My company," he nodded toward the house. "There's stew. It won't win a prize, but it's warm." Something in her chest gave way then, just a little. She followed him inside, removing her gloves, shaking the snow from her shawl. The scent of the stew was comforting, familiar. He served her quietly, as if the gesture needed no words. For a while they ate in silence, the firelight flickering across their faces. Outside the snow fell harder, wrapping the world in stillness. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. He looked up. "Miss what?" "Believing," she said. "In Christmas, in joy, in people." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I miss the woman who made me believe," he said finally. "But I don't miss the man I was when I lost her." Margaret lowered her eyes. "Then maybe you're not as broken as you think." He gave a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. "You sound certain of that. Maybe because I've seen worse things refuse to die. Hope, for instance." He studied her face, the quiet strength etched into every line of it. "You talk like someone who's seen hope suffer." "I have," she said softly, "but I've never seen it surrender." Their eyes met, and something inside both of them stilled. The air between them shimmered, not from heat, but from the nearness of two people standing too close to something they could not name. When Elsie's voice came from upstairs, calling for her mother, half asleep, half dreaming, the spell broke, gentle and reluctant. Margaret rose, smoothing her skirt. "She needs me," she murmured. Samuel stood as well. "Go on, then. I'll keep the fire." As she reached the stairs, she paused, glancing back. He stood near the hearth, the light catching the curve of his jaw, the rough grace of his posture. The image imprinted itself in her heart like a secret. Later, when the house was quiet again and Elsie slept soundly under the quilt, Margaret returned to the parlour. Samuel was still there, sitting in the chair near the window, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "You should rest," she said softly. "I can't sleep much these days," he replied. "The silence keeps me awake." "Then you're in good company," she whispered, taking the seat across from him. They sat without speaking for a long time, the fire their only witness. Every small sound seemed amplified, the crackle of the logs, the sigh of the wind, the faint rustle of fabric when she shifted in her chair. Finally, she said, "Do you ever wonder why two people cross paths when they shouldn't?" He turned to her, his expression unreadable but tender. "I think it's less about why they meet, and more about what they do once they have." Margaret felt her pulse in her throat. "And what do we do, Mr. Crowe?" His gaze lingered on her face, tracing the soft shadow beneath her cheekbones, the faint light caught in her hair. "We wait," he said quietly, "until the storm passes, or until it doesn't." Her lips curved, sad but understanding. "That doesn't sound much like hope." "It's the closest thing I've got," he murmured. The fire burned lower, but neither of them moved to leave. There was no need for touch, no need for promises. The warmth between them was already more than either had known in years. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady and unending, covering every scar of the land. Inside the small house at the edge of town, two souls scarred by time sat facing the fire, unaware that somewhere in the fragile stillness of that night, love, quiet, cautious, and impossible, had begun to take root. The storm that came that night did not roar. It whispered. It crept softly across the hills, pressing against the windows of red willow until every pane moaned under its weight. By morning, the town was buried under a silence so heavy it seemed to erase the very sound of life. The sky was a dull sheet of grey, and the snow lay in deep drifts, swallowing fences, tracks, and roads alike. Inside Margaret Doyle's house, the air carried that brittle chill that no fire could fully chase away. She stood near the hearth, stirring a pot of broth, her mind far from the motion of her hand. The flames flickered, throwing restless shadows on the walls, but her gaze kept wandering to the small form huddled beneath the quilt on the nearby cot. Elsie had taken ill 2 nights before. It had begun as a small cough, something Margaret thought a spoonful of honey might cure, but by dawn the cough had deepened into ragged gasps that tore through her sleep. Now the child's cheeks burned with fever, her lips dry, her small body trembling even under the weight of the blankets. Margaret had seen sickness before. She had nursed boarders, neighbours, even strangers through winter fevers, but never her child, never her only reason for enduring. And fear, cold and absolute, had settled in her chest, rooting deep. Samuel found her like that, standing still by the fire, her hand motionless over the spoon. He had returned early from his chores, his face flushed from the cold, his hair damp with melted snow. The moment he stepped through the door, he saw what the house itself already seemed to know. Something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, his voice quiet but urgent. Margaret turned to him, her expression strained. "It's Elsie. She's burning up. I can't bring the fever down." He crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside the cot. His hand, rough from labor, rested lightly against the child's forehead. "She's hot as coal," he murmured. Then, glancing up, "Has she seen the doctor?" "I can't fetch him in this storm," she said, shaking her head. "The road's gone, and the snow's too deep. He wouldn't make it here." Samuel stood, his jaw tightening. "Then I'll go to him." Margaret caught his arm before she even thought to stop herself. "You can't. You'll freeze before you reach town." Her fingers lingered on his sleeve, the warmth of his skin beneath the fabric, shocking her back to awareness. She pulled her hand away as if burned. "I didn't mean—" He met her eyes, the faintest softness breaking through his sternness. "I know, but she needs a doctor." "She needs her mother," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "And I won't lose her because I sent someone else into the storm." Their gazes held, 2 wills locked in the same fear, 2 hearts fighting the same impossible truth. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint sound of Elsie's breathing. Samuel exhaled slowly. "Then we keep her warm, boil water, change the cloths. She's strong. She'll fight it." He shed his coat and set to work without being told. He moved through the room with quiet efficiency, filling the kettle, chopping more wood, stoking the fire higher until the warmth reached the rafters. Margaret followed his lead, her hands trembling as she wrung the cloths and placed them gently over her daughter's forehead. Hours passed in that small rhythm of desperation, the kettle hissing, the clock ticking, the fire roaring against the wind that battered the walls. When Elsie stirred, her voice was barely a whisper. "Mama!" Margaret knelt beside her, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart. Rest now." The child's eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever. "Is it Christmas yet?" Margaret swallowed hard. "Not yet, my love. Soon." Samuel, standing behind her, watched the scene in silence. Something in him broke a little at the sound of that small, fragile voice. He turned away, pretending to tend the fire, but his shoulders stiffened with helpless emotion. As the day darkened, the snow fell thicker, muting the world. Margaret's exhaustion deepened. Her dress clung to her knees from spilled water, and her hair had come loose from its pins. Samuel noticed but said nothing. Instead, he moved closer, wordless, taking the cloth from her trembling hands. "Rest a minute," he said softly. "You're no good to her if you fall over." "I can't rest," she whispered. "Not while she burns like this." He looked at her then, not with authority but with a kind of quiet command born of care. "Then sit here, by the fire. I'll watch her a while." She hesitated, her eyes on him, uncertain whether she could trust anyone with what she loved most. But the steadiness in his face left no room for doubt. She sat reluctantly near the hearth, the warmth licking at her frozen feet. Samuel returned to the bedside, replacing the cloths, murmuring words the girl likely couldn't hear. Margaret watched him, her vision blurring from fatigue. There was something profoundly gentle in the way his large hands moved, the same hands that swung an axe and mended fences, now cooling a child's fever with infinite care. At one point, Elsie opened her eyes and whispered, "Are you staying, Mr. Crowe?" He smiled faintly. "For a while, little one." "Good," she murmured, her eyelids drooping. "Mama doesn't sleep much when she's scared." Margaret looked away, her throat tightening. Samuel glanced at her over his shoulder, but said nothing. Words, he knew, would only break the fragile peace they had built in that moment. By nightfall, the fever still raged. The house was hot from the fire, yet the fear in the air was colder than the storm outside. Margaret stood again, pacing, her hands pressed to her mouth. "It's not going down," she said, her voice cracking. "It should have by now." Samuel stepped closer. Sometimes fever fights hardest before it breaks. She turned to him, her composure shattering. And if it doesn't? He held her gaze. Then we keep fighting harder. For a long moment, they stood like that, two figures framed by firelight, shadows touching before their hands dared. The weight of her fear poured out in the tremor of her lips, in the way she finally let herself lean, just slightly, into the warmth of his presence. "Why are you here, Samuel?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely audible. "You could have left days ago, gone back to your ranch. You don't owe me anything." He looked at her, his expression raw. "Maybe I'm tired of leaving people who need me." Her breath caught. "You think we need you?" He hesitated. "I think you shouldn't have to face everything alone." The words landed between them like a confession. Margaret's heart beat faster, not from fear this time, but from the strange, impossible comfort of being seen. "I don't know how to depend on anyone anymore," she admitted. He stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "Then start small. Let me be here tonight." Margaret could not answer. Her throat closed around the words, but she nodded once, and that was enough. The hours blurred together after that. Samuel stayed by the cot, his hand sometimes resting on Elsie's shoulder, his quiet presence an anchor in the storm. Margaret drifted in and out of restless sleep by the fire, her body too weary to fight, but her heart refusing to give in. Sometime near dawn, Samuel felt the change before he could name it. The child's breathing had softened, evened out. He pressed his hand to her forehead and found the fever had eased. He exhaled a long, shaking breath, one he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned toward the hearth, where Margaret slept curled in the chair, her face peaceful for the first time in days. Strands of hair had fallen across her cheek, and her hands were still clasped together as if in prayer. Samuel watched her for a long time, the soft light from the fire gilding her skin. Something deep in him stirred, a tenderness he thought long buried, a need not to possess but to protect. When she stirred, he was at her side, his voice quiet. "Margaret, wake up." She blinked, disoriented, then gasped when she saw the change in her daughter's face. "She's sleeping." "She's better," Samuel said softly. "The fever's breaking." Margaret covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears rising fast. "Oh, thank God," she whispered. And then, without thought, she turned to Samuel. He caught her as she fell forward, not in weakness, but in sheer relief. Her arms went around him for just a moment, her cheek against his shoulder, and he held her instinctively. It was not passion that filled the space between them. It was something purer, deeper, the recognition of two souls who had both lived too long without warmth. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice barely more than air. Samuel's hands rested lightly on her back, careful not to betray the tremor running through him. "You don't have to thank me." She drew back then, her eyes glistening. "Yes, I do. You've done more than anyone ever has." He wanted to speak, to tell her what her words did to him, but he couldn't, so he only nodded, his gaze lingering on her face, on the tears that shimmered like small reflections of the firelight. Outside, the storm began to quiet. The first grey light of dawn crept through the window, pale and uncertain, like the world itself was holding its breath. Margaret turned back to her daughter, smoothing her hair. "She'll sleep for a while," she murmured. Samuel watched her kneel by the cot, her posture bowed yet graceful. She looked like both a mother and a prayer, and in that moment he knew that something inside him, something that had lain dormant since the day he buried his wife, had begun to wake again. He said nothing, only watched as she kissed her daughter's brow, whispering a soft lullaby that trembled with both exhaustion and hope. When Margaret finally rose, she met his eyes across the quiet room. "You should rest now," she said. "I will," he replied, though they both knew he wouldn't. She gave him a small, weary smile. "You're stubborn. And you're strong," he said softly. "But even the strong need rest." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then turned back to the fire. "Maybe someday," she murmured. Samuel's voice came gently behind her. "Someday starts with one morning." The house fell silent again, the kind of silence that no longer felt like loneliness, but like peace. The storm had passed. The child slept. And in the soft, uncertain light of dawn, two hearts that had once been nothing but shadows began, quietly, cautiously, to glow. Snow covered Red Willow in such perfect stillness that morning that the town seemed carved from silence itself. Roofs sagged beneath the weight of white, and the air shimmered faintly with the promise of more. From the church steeple, icicles hung like crystal pendants, catching what little light escaped the dull grey sky. Life moved slower now, every step measured, every sound softened by snow. Inside Margaret Doyle's boarding house, warmth flickered faintly, a fragile defiance against the bitter cold. The fire was small, wood had to last. She sat by the window, sewing with careful precision, though her thoughts were far from the needle in her hand. Every few moments she would glance toward the narrow bed by the hearth, where Elsie lay still recovering. The child slept peacefully now, her cheeks no longer flushed with fever, but pale from the long illness. Margaret's heart clenched every time her daughter coughed in her sleep, though she tried not to let it show. The days that followed the fever had blurred together. There had been exhaustion, relief, and something else, something quiet and frightening, that had lingered between her and Samuel Crowe. Since that long night, his presence in the house had felt different. The air itself seemed to change when he entered a room. He had spoken little since, as though words might undo what silence had built, but his kindness had not faltered. That morning, Margaret's concentration broke when she heard the faint creak of the back door. She looked up to find Samuel standing there, his shoulders dusted with snow, his coat open just enough to reveal the dark wool of his vest. His breath clouded in the cold as he closed the door gently behind him. "Morning," he said, his voice low. Margaret nodded. "You've been out since before dawn again." "Needed to check the fence line," he replied. "Something spooked the horses last night." "You work too hard," she said softly, not looking up from her stitching. "So do you," he countered. "Difference is you don't complain about it." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "And you do. Only to you," he said, and though his tone was calm, the honesty in it caught her off guard. She glanced up then, and their eyes met. The look lasted only a second, but it was enough to stir that familiar warmth beneath her ribs, the one she kept trying to ignore. He took a step closer. "How's Elsie?" "She's better," Margaret said. "Still weak, but she'll be herself soon." "I'm glad." His voice softened. "You did everything right." She gave a short laugh, weary but sincere. "I didn't do it alone." Samuel hesitated, then nodded. "I wasn't about to let either of you freeze." Margaret's eyes softened. "I know." The silence between them stretched, comfortable and dangerous all at once. The fire crackled faintly, the only witness to what neither of them dared to say. Then suddenly the sound of a knock shattered the quiet. Margaret's head turned toward the door, her heart tightening. Samuel moved first, opening it. A gust of cold swept in, along with Beatrice Harlan's familiar scent of perfume and condescension. "Mrs. Doyle," Beatrice said, stepping inside without invitation. "I came to see how the child was faring." Margaret stood, composed. "She's recovering, thank you." Beatrice's gaze slid from Margaret to Samuel, her expression sharp. "How fortunate that you had help." Samuel's jaw tensed, but Margaret laid a hand on the back of the chair, grounding herself. "Mr. Crowe has been kind enough to lend assistance these past days," she said evenly. "I am grateful." "Grateful," Beatrice repeated, her smile tightening. "Yes, I'm sure you are. Still, one must think of propriety. It isn't suitable for a woman, alone, to host a man beneath her roof." The words hung like frost in the air. Samuel's voice came quiet, steady. "Ma'am, Mrs. Doyle doesn't answer to anyone's gossip." Beatrice turned to him, eyes narrowing. "You're new here, Mr. Crowe. You may not understand that reputation is all a woman like her has left." Margaret's breath caught, and Samuel's face darkened, though his tone remained controlled. then I'd say her reputation is worth defending, especially from people who mistake cruelty for conversation. Beatrice drew herself up, affronted. You presume too much, sir. And you say too much, he replied. For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then Beatrice gave a clipped smile, smoothing her gloves. I shall pray that you both find wisdom. Good day. She left in a flurry of cold air and indignation. The door closed sharply behind her. Margaret stood motionless for a long time, her fingers tightening on the chair. You shouldn't have said that, she whispered finally. Samuel turned toward her. Someone needed to. She'll ruin me, Margaret said, her voice low but shaking. You don't understand what that woman is capable of. Words travel here faster than truth ever could. He took a step forward, his expression unreadable. Let her talk. You've done nothing to be ashamed of. Margaret's control broke. That doesn't matter. In this town, perception is everything. I've spent years keeping my head high, surviving their whispers. Now one act of kindness from you, one act of decency, and it could all be undone. Samuel studied her face, her trembling hands, the fear behind her anger. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. Then marry me. The words struck her like a blow. She froze, her eyes widening. What did you say? Marry me, he repeated. You and Elsie deserve more than gossip and struggle. I've got land, a house, enough to see you through the winter and everyone after it. It doesn't have to be sentimental. It's practical. Margaret stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. You call that practical? He met her gaze steadily. I'm offering you a way to stop fighting alone. Is that what you think this is? Her voice shook now, the tremor of old wounds surfacing. A rescue? A transaction? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? She demanded, her cheeks flushed. He hesitated, the first flicker of vulnerability breaking through his composure. I meant that I can keep you safe, both of you. She laughed then, a short, broken sound. Safe? There's no safety in this world, Mr. Crowe. Not for women like me, not for anyone who's already been marked. Samuel took another step toward her, but she held up a hand. Don't. His jaw clenched. You think I'm trying to own you? I don't know what you're trying to do, she said, her voice trembling now. But whatever it is, I can't accept it. I can't live as someone's debt, someone's burden. His eyes darkened, the faintest ache breaking through his calm. You're not a burden. I am to you, she said softly. You just don't see it yet. The silence that followed was painful in its purity. The fire popped once, sending a small spray of embers into the air. Samuel's voice came low, steady. You deserve peace, Margaret. You deserve someone standing beside you, not across from you. She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering. And you deserve a woman who can give you more than gratitude. Neither of them moved. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. The distance between them was only a few feet, yet it felt like a chasm years wide. After a long moment, Samuel exhaled. I didn't mean to insult you. I know you didn't, she said, her voice breaking. That's what makes it worse. He looked down, the weight of her words sinking deep. Then I'll stop asking. Please do, she whispered. He nodded once, turned, and walked toward the door. But before he stepped out, he paused. I didn't come here looking for anything. I only wanted to help. But somewhere along the way, you became the only thing that feels right. Her breath caught. She wanted to tell him to stay, to say that his presence had changed her world in ways she could barely admit to herself. But pride and fear tangled in her throat, and she said nothing. When the door closed, the house fell back into silence. The kind of silence that felt too large for one person to hold. Margaret sat slowly, her heart heavy, her thoughts tangled between gratitude and regret. She stared into the fire, watching the flames shift and fade. The room still carried his warmth, the faint scent of wood smoke and pine clinging to the air. From the cot, Elsie stirred, murmuring in her sleep. Margaret rose at once, smoothing her daughter's hair. The touch steadied her, reminded her of what mattered most. And yet, even as she whispered to the child, she could not quiet the echo of Samuel's words, "Marry me." It was not a declaration. It was a lifeline offered by a man who believed in shelter more than sentiment. And yet, beneath those practical syllables, she had heard something else, something raw and unspoken that frightened her more than the gossip of any woman in town. When she finally blew out the lamp, the darkness that filled the room did not feel empty. It felt like waiting. Waiting for something that neither of them was brave enough to name. Outside, the wind eased and snow continued to fall, soft and soundless, as if the world itself were holding its breath between one heartbeat and the next. The night of the church gathering arrived under a low, restless sky. Red Willow had prepared itself for celebration, though celebration in that town was never a matter of abundance, but of stubborn faith. From every window along Main Street, lanterns hung like small suns against the dark, their light trembling in the wind. The church stood at the center of it all, a plain wooden building wrapped in garlands of pine, its steeple cutting through the heavy clouds like a prayer. Inside, the air smelled of wax and smoke, of damp wool and sugared bread. The whole town had turned out, farmers, merchants, their wives and daughters, faces rosy from the cold, voices low and eager to trade news. Margaret Doyle stood among them, her shawl drawn close, her gloved hands folded before her as though she might disappear into stillness. She had not wanted to come, but Elsie had begged, and there were few things she could deny the child these days. Elsie darted through the crowd now, her laughter soft but bright, like a bird's song cutting through the hush. Margaret watched her with the careful eye of a mother who knew joy could be fleeting. She felt the weight of the room pressing in, the glances, the whispers that followed her like threads of smoke. She had known this would happen since Beatrice Harlan's visit days earlier. Every whisper in Red Willow grew roots, and by now the story of the widow and the rancher was surely the evening's favorite hymn. She turned slightly, meaning to find the safest corner to stand, but stopped when she saw him. Samuel Crowe had entered quietly, as he always did. He stood near the back, removing his hat, his expression unreadable. He looked almost out of place, too solemn for festivity, too real for the delicate pretense that filled the room. His coat was dark, dusted with snow at the shoulders, and the lamplight caught the edge of his jaw, the faint silver at his temples. Their eyes met across the crowded space. It was not a glance of surprise, but of inevitability, as though the air between them had known before they did that they would look for each other. Samuel inclined his head in greeting, a gesture so slight and respectful it made her pulse quicken. Margaret's breath caught, and she quickly looked away, pretending to admire the wreath above the pulpit. Reverend Keene called for quiet, his voice warm and sonorous. "We gather tonight," he said, "not because our lives are without hardship, but because even in hardship we are blessed to find light." There were nods, murmurs of agreement, and then the sound of the organ began, a simple tune, old and familiar. Margaret tried to listen, but her mind wandered. She felt Samuel's presence behind her like a current in the air, steady and unyielding. When the hymn ended, Beatrice Harlan rose from her pew, the rustle of her fine skirt slicing through the quiet. "If I may," she said, smiling tightly, "I think it's worth reminding everyone that light can only live where virtue does." The words fell with deliberate weight. Margaret's shoulders tensed. She could feel it, the sudden shift in the room, the glances sliding like knives. Beatrice continued, her voice smooth and falsely pious. "Some among us have forgotten that example," she said. "A woman's conduct reflects upon us all. It is our duty to uphold what is proper, lest our children grow thinking shame is the same as courage." Reverend Keene's brow furrowed. "Mrs. Harlan," but Beatrice pressed on, "I mean no harm, of course. I only speak what many are too polite to say." The tension snapped like glass. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. Every eye seemed to burn against her skin, every whisper slicing closer. Her mouth opened, to defend herself, to end it, but no sound came. Then from the back of the church a voice cut through the murmur. "Enough!" It was Samuel. His tone was not raised, but it carried easily across the room. The authority in it was quiet, absolute. All turned to look at him. He stood straight, his hat in one hand, his gaze fixed on Beatrice with calm that bordered on dangerous. "Mrs. Doyle has done nothing deserving of your malice," he said. "She's shown more courage than most men I know. The only shame here is in how quick some folks are to forget what kindness looks like." A hush followed. Beatrice's lips tightened, color rising to her cheeks. "You presume much, Mr. Crowe. This is a church, not your barn." Samuel's eyes did not waver. "Then maybe start acting like it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed to break the silence. The Reverend cleared his throat, trying to ease the moment. "We are here in fellowship," he said, "not judgment." Beatrice sank back into her seat, her composure cracking. Samuel turned then, meeting Margaret's gaze across the pews. In his expression, she saw no pride, no triumph, only quiet defense, an instinct that came from somewhere deeper than reason. Her heart trembled. She wanted to look away, but her eyes refused. Something had shifted irrevocably between them. After the service, people filed out slowly, their voices low, their glances heavier than ever. Margaret gathered Elsie's cloak, her hands shaking slightly. "Mr. Crowe," someone whispered near the doorway. "Bold of him." "Foolish," another replied. "No woman's worth that kind of trouble." Outside, the night was cold enough to bite through wool. Snow drifted softly under the lamplight, turning the path home into a silver trail. Margaret had just stepped outside when Samuel appeared beside her. "You shouldn't have done that," she said without turning. He adjusted his gloves. "You'd rather I'd stood quiet while she tried to humiliate you? I'd rather you hadn't given her something new to use against us both." He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold. "If people like her need a story to tell, they'll invent one whether we give them reason or not." She stopped then, facing him. The snowflakes clung to her hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and from anger she wasn't sure was truly anger. "You think it's so simple," she said. "You don't know what it is to live under their eyes, to have your child hear their whispers." His gaze softened. "Maybe I don't, but I know what it's like to see someone worth protecting and to stand by while others tear her apart. I won't do it again." The words struck her harder than she expected. Her voice faltered. "Why? Why do you care what happens to me?" For a long moment he didn't answer. The lantern above them flickered in the wind, lighting his face in fragments, jawline, eyes, the faint crease between his brows. "Because I see you," he said finally, his voice low. "I see the way you fight every day to hold your life together when no one else lifts a hand to help. I see the way you keep standing when the world would rather see you fall." Her throat tightened. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because it makes it harder," she whispered. "To keep the distance I've worked so hard to keep." He stood just inches away now. The heat from his body reached her even through the cold, through layers of wool and restraint. "Maybe that distance isn't keeping you safe," he said quietly. "Maybe it's just keeping you lonely." She drew in a sharp breath. The sound of the wind filled the space between them, the town behind them disappearing into a blur of lights and shadows. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't risk what little peace I've built." "I'm not asking you to risk it," he replied, his tone softening. "I'm asking you to let me stand beside it." Her lips parted as though to answer, but no words came. Instead, her eyes fell, her hand clutching the edge of her shawl. Samuel's voice lowered further, tender but steady. "You don't owe me anything, Margaret, but I meant what I said inside that church. I'll defend you, even if it costs me favor with every soul in this town." Her eyes lifted, shining with unshed tears. "Why?" she asked again, though this time her voice was not defiant. It was fragile, almost pleading. He hesitated, then said, "Because when I see you, I remember that not everything good in this world has been lost to me." The silence that followed was thick with everything neither dared to say. Then Elsie's laughter broke through it, soft, sleepy, as she tugged at her mother's hand. "Mama, can we go home?" Margaret blinked away the tears, bending to adjust the child's scarf. "Yes, sweetheart, home." She straightened and met Samuel's gaze one last time. "Thank you," she said softly. He tipped his hat. "Always." As they walked away, Margaret felt the echo of his words linger long after the sound of their footsteps faded. Snow fell heavier now, each flake catching the light like ash and silver. She looked up once, unable to stop herself, and saw him still standing there at the gate, watching them disappear into the glow of the lanterns. Something in her heart whispered that life had just changed again, though she could not yet see how. Inside her small house, when the door closed and the wind pressed softly against the walls, she stood for a long time in the dim light, her thoughts a quiet storm. Samuel's voice still echoed in her chest, low, certain, tender, and though she tried to bury it beneath reason and fear, it lingered, warm and unyielding. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Red Willow, covering every trace of footsteps, every mark left by judgment or pride. It covered the small wooden house too, turning it into a quiet sanctuary beneath the winter sky, a place where, for one fragile night, even the most wounded hearts could dare to feel seen. The snow that had blanketed Red Willow for weeks began to melt that morning, though the air was still sharp enough to bite through wool. The thaw came slowly, revealing the brown earth beneath, the slush of the road, and the faint sound of dripping from the rooftops. It should have been a sign of relief, a whisper of spring waiting beyond the cold. But in Margaret Doyle's heart, there was no such easing. She stood by the window, her hands clasped around a cup of tea gone cold, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the hills rose like sleeping beasts. Behind her, Elsie hummed softly as she played with her doll, the sound tender and light, filling the small room with warmth. Yet Margaret could not bring herself to smile. Since that night at the church, since Samuel's defense and his quiet confession in the snow, her world had changed. Not outwardly. The days still followed their humble rhythm of chores and care, but inside her something had begun to stir, a longing she did not dare to name. A fear she could not soothe. She had not seen Samuel for 3 days. He had gone back to his ranch, he'd said, to tend to work left undone. But his absence filled the house more completely than his presence ever had. The silence now seemed lonelier, the air colder. Every time she passed the empty chair by the fire, she caught herself glancing toward it, half expecting to find him there again. Hat in hand, eyes steady and unreadable, as though he belonged to the quiet itself. She told herself it was foolish, that she should be grateful for the peace of his absence, for the return of routine. And yet, gratitude did not come. That afternoon, while the sun hung weakly behind a veil of grey, the sound of hooves broke through the stillness. Margaret's heart leapt before she could stop it. She moved to the window just as the rider appeared through the mist, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat dark against the pale light. Samuel Crowe. He dismounted slowly, tying his horse to the post. There was something different about his posture, tense, wary. Margaret hurried to open the door before he could knock. "Mr. Crowe," she said, breathless though she didn't know why. "You're back." "I am," he said quietly, brushing the snow from his coat. His expression was grave, his eyes shadowed. "We need to talk." The words sent a chill through her. "Has something happened?" He hesitated, then stepped inside. The warmth of the house enveloped him, softening the edges of his presence. "Someone came to my ranch yesterday," he said. "A man I used to know. He brought news." "Bad news?" "The kind that follows you no matter how far you ride." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair, clearly searching for the right words. "It seems word of our arrangement, or what people think it is, has spread beyond town, and someone's decided to make use of it." Margaret frowned, confused. "I don't understand." "Beatrice Harlan's brother," he said finally. "He's sent word to the magistrate in Cheyenne, accusing me of improper conduct, of harboring a woman of ill repute." The color drained from her face. That's absurd. I know it is, he said, his jaw tightening. But men in offices don't always care for truth when rumor will do. Margaret felt the room tilt slightly, her heart thundering in her chest. What will they do? They'll investigate, and if they find reason enough, they'll fine us both, or worse. Her hand flew to her mouth. My daughter. She'll be safe, Samuel said quickly. I'll make sure of it. That's why I came. Her eyes searched his face. What are you saying? I'm saying you can't stay here. Not for now. Margaret shook her head. This is my home. I know, he said gently, but it's also the first place they'll come. You and Elsie need to come with me, to my ranch, until this passes. She stared at him, stunned. Do you hear yourself? If they already believe the worst, what do you think they'll say when I go to live under your roof? He met her gaze squarely. Let them talk. I won't let them harm you. Margaret turned away, gripping the back of the chair for balance. I can't. You can, he said, stepping closer. You just won't. The tension between them pulsed like a heartbeat. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with defiance and fear. You don't understand what you're asking of me. He reached for her hand, his touch firm but careful. I do. I'm asking you to trust me. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened just enough to hold her still. Trust has cost me everything before, she whispered. I'm not the man who took everything from you, he said softly, and I never will be. Their eyes locked, and in that gaze was everything unspoken, loneliness, pride, the ache of unfulfilled tenderness. For a long moment, neither of them breathed. Then Elsie's voice broke through the silence. Mama? Is Mr. Crowe staying for supper? Margaret blinked as though waking from a spell. Go wash your hands, dear, she said faintly. We'll see. The child ran off, humming. Samuel released her hand slowly. Please think about it, he said. The snow's melting, but the mud on those roads will trap a wagon quick. We don't have long before the magistrate's men reach town. She nodded, though her heart still raced. You're certain? Yes, he said, and I won't leave you to face them alone. When he was gone, the house felt too quiet again, the shadows too deep. Margaret sat by the window long after dark, her hands clasped tightly together. The storm outside had ended, but another brewed within her. A battle between fear and trust, between dignity and the desire to finally rest her burdens somewhere other than her own shoulders. The next day came heavy with clouds. By noon, riders arrived, 2 men in long coats, strangers whose presence made the town's whispers flare anew. They stopped at the general store first, then at the livery, and finally, inevitably, at her door. Margaret met them with her chin raised. Mrs. Doyle? One of them asked. We're here on account of an inquiry. She stood straight, the quiet strength in her voice surprising even herself. You'll find I have nothing to hide. Their questions were curt, their tones polite but distant. She answered each one carefully, her composure unbroken even as shame crept into her veins. When they left, the relief she expected did not come. The damage was already done. That evening, as dusk bled into night, a knock sounded again. She opened the door to find Samuel standing there, his expression unreadable. They've gone to my ranch, he said. Asked my men questions, turned through my things as if looking for proof. Of what? He gave a humorless smile. Of a woman I supposedly keep hidden. Margaret's stomach turned. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Don't be, he said, his voice rough. You warned me what gossip can do. I didn't listen. For a long moment they stood in the doorway, snow falling in soft flakes between them. Then he said quietly, The only way to end this is to give them something true. She frowned. What do you mean? He stepped closer, his voice low. If they want a scandal, we'll give them a marriage instead. Her breath caught. Samuel, hear me out, he said. If we're married, they can't accuse you of impropriety. They'll have no grounds to take your home, no right to your shame. Margaret stared at him, the words striking deep. You can't mean that. I do, he said simply. It's the only way to protect you. You'd marry me to silence a lie? I'd marry you to make it irrelevant, he replied. Her eyes shimmered. And what about love? Or does that not matter? Samuel's gaze softened, the hint of a sad smile forming. It matters more than anything. That's why I can't stand by while the world ruins you for something you never did. She shook her head, tears threatening now. You don't know what you're saying. You'll regret it. I've regretted more by saying nothing. The air between them thickened, trembling with everything they could not yet speak. Please, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Let me help you. Margaret's eyes lifted to his, full of fear and longing. If I say yes, she whispered, what becomes of me? Of us? He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. Then you'll never face another day in this town, alone again. Her tears fell freely now, though she did not pull away. The warmth of his touch melted through every wall she had built. For the first time in years, she let herself imagine a world where safety and love might exist in the same breath. Let me think, she said finally, her voice trembling. Samuel nodded, releasing her hand though his gaze lingered. I'll wait, he said, as long as it takes. When he left, Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. The room seemed brighter somehow, the fire more alive. Outside, the snow began again, falling slowly, softly, like a promise whispered to the earth. And though she told herself that his offer was only practical, only protection, she knew the truth her heart had already accepted, that it was not reason that made her tremble, but love. The morning after the storm dawned pale and still, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper, every heartbeat louder. Frost clung to the glass panes of the boarding house like lace, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something new. Anticipation, fragile but alive. Margaret Doyle sat at the table, her hands clasped around a cup of tea she had not touched. Her eyes were unfocused, lost somewhere far beyond the small window, where the world shimmered beneath a thin veil of ice. Elsie played quietly near the hearth, her doll tucked beneath a scrap of quilt. The child's cheeks had regained their color, her laughter soft again, yet Margaret's heart could not rest. The echo of Samuel's words from the night before filled every corner of her mind. If they want a scandal, we'll give them a marriage instead. She had barely slept. The fire had burned low, the house had creaked with the cold, and still her thoughts had circled back to him. To the steadiness in his voice, to the sorrow behind his offer, to the dangerous tenderness she'd seen in his eyes. When a knock sounded on the door, soft but firm, she knew before opening it who it was. Samuel stood there, hat in hand, his breath misting in the crisp air. He looked as though he had not slept either. Behind him, the dawn painted the snow in shades of gold and grey, and the world seemed to hold itself still for them. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Good morning," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He hesitated before stepping inside. "I didn't want to presume, but I needed to know if you'd made a decision." Margaret closed the door gently, turning to face him. The space between them felt charged, almost sacred. "I haven't," she admitted. "Not yet." He nodded slowly, as though he had expected as much. "Then maybe I can help you decide." She frowned slightly. "By convincing me, by telling you the truth," he said. "The kind I've avoided saying until now." The fire crackled softly behind them. Samuel set his hat down, his hands restless before finally settling at his sides. "When I asked you to marry me, I said it was to protect you. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." Her breath caught. "Samuel." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I told myself it was only right, that it was duty or decency or whatever name a man gives to the things he can't explain. But it wasn't duty that kept me here, Margaret. It wasn't decency that made me walk through the storm that night to your door. It was you." The words hung between them, fragile as spun glass. She stood motionless, unable to speak. He took a slow step closer. "You think I don't know what loneliness feels like? I've lived in its company longer than I've lived with anyone. But since the day I met you, the silence doesn't feel the same. The air feels different, lighter. You and that child have made a place in me I didn't know was still alive." Her heart ached at the rawness in his voice. "Samuel, you don't have to say these things. It isn't proper," he finished, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I've stopped caring about what's proper, Margaret. The town can whisper all it wants, let them, but I won't stand by and watch them tear apart what's decent and good." She turned away, pressing a hand to her chest. "You don't understand. If I accept, it won't be just the whispers, it'll be everything. Every door that closes, every kindness withdrawn. You'll lose more than you think." He took another step toward her, his voice lower now. "Then let me lose it, for something worth having." Her eyes met his then, shining with tears she refused to shed. "You speak as if this were easy, as if love could erase everything the world does to people like us." "I don't expect it to erase anything," he said softly, "only to make it bearable." The silence that followed was deep, the kind that carried its own weight. The clock ticked faintly in the corner. The fire hissed and sighed. Then from the window came the faint sound of a wagon. Margaret moved instinctively to the glass and froze. Two riders were approaching from the east, their coats marked with the insignia of the magistrate's office. "They're here," she whispered. Samuel's jaw tightened. "So soon." He grabbed his coat. "Get Elsie ready." "Ready for what?" "For whatever comes," he said. "If they mean trouble, we face it together." Margaret turned toward him sharply. "No, I won't let them drag you into this." He shook his head, his voice firm. "You don't get to decide that." The knock that followed was sharp, commanding. Margaret's pulse thundered as she opened the door. The men stood with stern faces, their breath pluming in the cold. "Mrs. Doyle?" the taller one said. "We're here to conclude our inquiry." She forced herself to meet their gaze. "You've asked your questions already." The man nodded. "And received our answers from half the town. Unfortunately, rumors don't settle themselves. We'll need to confirm your living arrangements once more." His gaze flicked to Samuel. "Mr. Crowe." Samuel's posture was calm, steady. "I'm here because she asked for help. You'll find no law broken under this roof." The magistrate's man raised an eyebrow. "Then you won't mind if we take a statement?" "Perhaps jointly." Margaret stiffened. "That won't be necessary." "It will be," the man replied smoothly. "Unless you'd prefer your case be moved to Cheyenne, where the penalties are far less forgiving." Her breath faltered. Samuel stepped forward, his voice measured. "We'll give you your statement." He looked at her then, his gaze deep and unwavering, as if to say, "Trust me." When the men had gone, satisfied and silent, Margaret sank into the chair by the fire. Her hands trembled. "What did you tell them?" "The truth," Samuel said, "that you and I intend to marry." Her head snapped up. "You didn't." "I did." "Samuel, that was reckless. We haven't—" "Then tell me no," he interrupted softly. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll go back out there and set it right." She opened her mouth, but no words came. The room seemed to spin with the enormity of what he had done. He moved closer, kneeling before her. "I'll protect you, Margaret, not because it's my duty, because it's what I want. Because every time I walk away from you, it feels like I'm leaving something behind that I can't live without." Her tears fell then, silent and unrestrained. He reached up, brushing one away with the gentlest touch of his thumb. "You can't keep saving me," she whispered. "Then let me stand beside you while you save yourself," he said. The fire crackled between them, its glow painting their faces in gold and shadow. For the first time, she let herself truly look at him, at the scar near his temple, the faint grey threading his beard, the weariness in his eyes that matched her own. "You're a stubborn man, Samuel Crowe," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "So they tell me." She drew a shaky breath. "And if I say yes?" His gaze deepened. "Then the world outside can turn to ash for all I care." Margaret stood slowly, her heart hammering. The space between them was only a breath now. The warmth of the fire mingled with the warmth of his presence, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. "You shouldn't have forced my hand," she whispered. "I didn't," he said. "You already knew your answer." Her hand lifted before she could stop it, brushing against his face. The roughness of his jaw beneath her fingers made her tremble. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "So am I," he said quietly. "But I'd rather be afraid with you than brave without you." Her laugh broke through the tears, soft and trembling. "You have a way of saying the wrong thing beautifully. Then maybe it's the right thing after all." Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, sweeping through the valley, carrying with it the faint scent of thawing earth and wood smoke. Samuel took her hand, pressing it gently to his chest. "This isn't a promise I make lightly," he said. "I've buried too much to make another I can't keep. But I'll keep this one, Margaret. You have my word." She looked up at him, her lips trembling, her heart no longer steady but alive. "Then you have mine." In that small room, with the fire burning low and the snow melting softly against the window pane, the world narrowed to the space between two people who had spent too long denying what their hearts already knew. He leaned closer, not to claim, not to demand, but to breathe the same air as her, to share the silence that had finally turned into something tender. Their foreheads touched lightly, the simplest of gestures, yet it felt like a vow. For the first time in years, Margaret felt no fear of the morning to come. The snow outside continued to fall in slow, shimmering flakes, each one catching the light before disappearing into the thaw, like every sorrow they had carried, now melting quietly into something that might, at last, be love. The days that followed Samuel's declaration moved with a strange, suspended intensity, as if Red Willow itself had taken a breath and refused to release it. The snow still lay heavy in the shadowed corners of the town, yet the streets had begun to soften with thaw, turning white into slush and slush into mud. Boots sank deeper now, wheels groaned. The world looked as if it could change at any moment, and in Margaret Doyle's heart, that feeling was no longer only fear, it was possibility. She woke before dawn on the morning Reverend Keene asked them to come to the church meeting room. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the air cool enough to sting, but Margaret rose with purpose. She dressed carefully, as if every button were an oath. Her wool dress was plain, dark, and neatly mended at the cuffs. She pinned her hair into its low bun, and for once she did not do it as armor alone. She did it as a woman preparing to stand in the open without flinching. Elsie woke too, rubbing her eyes, her voice still soft with sleep. "Mamma, are we in trouble?" Margaret knelt and smoothed the child's braid, her fingertips lingering in a tenderness that steadied her. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're going to tell the truth out loud, that's all." Elsie blinked at her, then looked past her shoulder to Samuel, who stood near the doorway fastening his gloves. The child watched him with solemn certainty. "Mr. Crowe always tells the truth." Samuel's expression softened in a way that made Margaret's breath catch. He crouched to Elsie's height, adjusting her scarf with careful hands. "Truth's easier when you're brave," he said. Elsie nodded as though bravery were as simple as tying a ribbon. "Mama's brave." Margaret's throat tightened. She looked at Samuel across the dim room, and for a moment everything in her wanted to say what she still could not shape into words. But his gaze met hers, steady, patient, the kind of looking that did not demand. It only stayed. It only held. At the church, the meeting room smelled of candle wax and pine. A small stove glowed in the corner. Folding chairs had been arranged in a stiff half-circle, as if order might tame whatever storm the town had brewed. Otis Whitaker stood near the window with his ledgers under his arm, his spectacles catching the pale daylight. Reverend Keene waited by the table, hands folded, face weary with worry but firm with purpose. Beatrice Harlan was already there, dressed in her finest dark wool with her gloves on, as if her hands were too clean for reality. She sat upright, lips pressed thin, her gaze sharp enough to cut, and with her leaning against the wall like a man who believed himself untouchable, stood Jedediah Pike. He was polished in a way no honest winter work could produce, his coat too tailored, his boots too clean, his smile too calm. When Samuel entered with Margaret and Elsie, Pike's eyes gleamed with a private satisfaction, as though the room had finally delivered him the prize he wanted. Margaret felt Samuel's hand brush lightly against the small of her back. Not possessive, not bold, only there. A quiet promise placed on her spine. She drew a breath and kept walking. Reverend Keene cleared his throat. "We are here," he said, "because rumor has become an instrument of harm in this town, and harm requires correction." Beatrice's smile sharpened. "Correction begins with confession, Reverend." Margaret did not look at her. She kept her eyes on the table, on the simple Bible resting there, on the ledgers Otis held like a shield. Otis stepped forward. His voice was gentle, but there was steel under it. "I've kept accounts in this town for years. I've watched honest men struggle and dishonest men prosper. I didn't want to believe it was happening here, but numbers don't lie. People do." Pike's smile didn't fade, but his eyes narrowed. "Careful, Whitaker. Accusations are dangerous." Otis lifted the ledger. "So is fraud." A murmur moved through the room. Beatrice shifted in her chair, her gloved fingers tightening. Reverend Keene gestured. "Mr. Whitaker, tell us what you found." Otis opened the book, turning pages with deliberate care. "Over the last several months, Mr. Pike has extended credit to townsfolk at rates that change without notice. He records one figure when a debt is made and another when payment is due. He adds fees that aren't signed for, charges interest on interest, and uses the confusion of winter hardship to collect more than he is owed." Pike's expression remained composed. "Business is business, not when it's theft," Otis replied quietly. Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't come here to watch men fight with paper. She had come to survive the cruelty that paper could justify. She looked at Samuel, at the tight set of his jaw, at the calm in his eyes, and felt the strange comfort of having someone beside her who would not step away. Beatrice leaned forward, her voice sweet. "And what does this have to do with Mrs. Doyle? We all know why the magistrate's men came. We all know why the town has been concerned." Samuel's voice came low and controlled. "You weren't concerned, you were entertained." Beatrice's eyes flashed. "How dare you? How dare you call it virtue?" He cut in, still quiet, still steady. "When you used a child's illness and a woman's solitude as fuel for your gossip." The room went still. Margaret's fingers trembled, but she did not hide them. She placed her hand lightly on the table edge, grounding herself. "I won't be spoken about as if I'm not here," she said, her voice calm despite the pounding in her chest. "I've lived under whispers long enough." Pike's smile returned, thin and smug. "Then speak plainly, Mrs. Doyle. Who is the father of your child?" Elsie's hand tightened in Margaret's. The question struck like a slap, not for its cruelty alone, but for its power to drag the past into the room like a corpse no one wanted to bury properly. Margaret looked at Pike, and for the first time she truly saw him. Not as a man with influence, but as a man who fed on humiliation. "You don't get to demand my story," she said softly, "but I will tell what matters, because I'm done being afraid of it." Samuel's breath shifted beside her. His gaze stayed on her face, not on the room, as if he were willing her to feel safe enough to breathe. Margaret lifted her chin. "Elsie's father is not in this town. He promised marriage and vanished before he could be held to it. That shame belongs to him, not to my child." Beatrice's mouth tightened, triumphant, as though that admission alone were victory. But Otis spoke again, turning another page. "It matters who he was, because the name appears here." Margaret froze. Otis looked up, his eyes kind but firm. "The man's name is in Mr. Pike's records, not as a debtor, as an employee, a man collecting fees." A ripple went through the room, the kind that changes the air. Pike's smile faltered for the first time. Margaret's heart thudded painfully. "What are you saying?" Otis swallowed. I'm saying that the man who left you did not simply run from responsibility. He was already tangled in Pike's dealings. He took money, did work for him, and disappeared with more than one person's peace. Pike stepped forward, his voice suddenly harder. That's enough. Samuel moved too, placing himself subtly between Pike and Margaret. He didn't raise his hands, didn't threaten. He simply stood there like an unmovable truth. Reverend Keen's voice was sharp. Mr. Pike, if these accusations are false, you may defend yourself, but you will not intimidate anyone under this roof. Pike's nostrils flared. His gaze flicked to Beatrice, and in that glance, Margaret understood something terrible and clarifying. Beatrice was not the engine of this cruelty. She was only one of its eager passengers. Beatrice rose, her voice trembling with outrage. This is absurd. My brother would never. Your brother doesn't need to do anything, Otis said gently. You did enough on your own, Mrs. Harlan, by sending those rumors beyond town. You let a magistrate's office become a weapon because it pleased you to see someone bleed. Beatrice's eyes widened, the mask cracking. I only wanted propriety. Propriety is not righteousness, Reverend Keen said, his tone heavy with disappointment. It is often only pride dressed in scripture. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched for years. The room was no longer a courtroom built to punish her. It was becoming a mirror, one that reflected the ugliness back to those who had created it. Pike tried again, voice smooth, dangerous. Even if my records were imperfect, it has nothing to do with the question of Mrs. Doyle's conduct. Samuel's gaze turned to him like winter steel. It has everything to do with it. You used money and influence to turn her into a spectacle, and you did it because you assumed she had no one to stand with her. Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. He placed it on the table in front of Reverend Keen. I asked Otis to help me prepare this, Samuel said quietly. It's the notice of intent. I'm marrying Margaret Doyle. A hush fell so complete it felt like snow settling. Margaret's breath caught, her eyes snapping to him. He hadn't warned her he would do this in front of them all, but when she looked at his face, she understood. He wasn't forcing her. He was giving her the shield he'd promised, made of truth, not secrecy. Beatrice's lips parted in disbelief. Pike's face tightened, the calculation in his eyes turning sharp. Margaret's heart pounded. In that moment, she could have stepped back, could have chosen silence, could have protected herself by refusing to be seen. Instead, she placed her hand over Samuel's on the table. The touch was small, but it felt like a bell rung into the world. Yes, Margaret said, her voice trembling and clear. He is. Samuel's gaze flicked to her, and in it, there was a depth of emotion that made her almost dizzy. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His eyes spoke the tenderness he kept restrained, the devotion he was still learning to allow himself. Reverend Keen's expression softened. Then we will proceed properly, he said, voice warm, with dignity, with witness. Pike's voice cut in, low and bitter. You think a marriage will erase her past? Margaret turned to him slowly. Her voice came soft, but it carried. My past isn't a stain. It's proof I survived. Pike's jaw clenched. You'll regret tying yourself to a man with debts. Samuel's gaze did not waver. My ranch stands, my accounts are honest, and your influence ends here. Otis lifted the ledger again. The magistrate's men can review these records. If they do, Mr. Pike, you won't be fining anyone. You'll be answering for what you've done. Pike's nostrils flared. For a moment he looked as though he might lash out. Then he forced a smile. Thin, brittle. Because he understood the room had shifted against him, he backed away. This town is getting sentimental, he muttered. Dangerous habit. He left without another word, his boots striking hard against the church floor. Beatrice remained standing, trembling with rage and humiliation. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for sympathy and finding none. She swallowed, her voice small and sharp. You'll all regret this. Reverend Keen's gaze was steady. We will regret only the years we allowed cruelty to pass for virtue. Beatrice's shoulders stiffened. Then she turned and walked out, her cape sweeping behind her like a shadow finally denied its audience. When the door closed, the room seemed to exhale. Margaret realized her hands were shaking. Elsie leaned against her, looking up with solemn certainty. "Does this mean Mr. Crowe will be my papa?" Margaret's throat tightened. She looked at Samuel, fear and tenderness tangling inside her. Samuel crouched again, his voice gentle. "It means I'll be here," he said, "if you want me." Elsie nodded with a seriousness that made Margaret's eyes burn. "I want." Samuel's gaze lifted to Margaret's, question and devotion woven together. "And you?" he asked quietly. In that moment, Margaret understood what had been quietly repaired inside her over these weeks, not by grand declarations, but by steady presence, by the way he waited, by the way he defended without demanding, by the way he saw her without turning her into a story for others to consume. "Yes," she whispered, "I want you." The words were simple, but they landed like a promise, strong enough to hold a life. Later that evening, the church square glowed with lantern light. The town's modest Christmas tree stood decorated with pine cones and ribbon scraps, humble and brave in its cheer. Snow began to fall again, soft and slow, the kind that made everything look new. Margaret stood beside Samuel near the edge of the gathering. Elsie ran ahead, laughing, her small boots kicking up powder. Samuel turned slightly toward Margaret, his voice low so only she could hear. "I didn't plan to speak in front of them all." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You did it anyway." "I did," he admitted, "because if I'm going to love you, I won't do it quietly, like it's something shameful." Her breath caught on the word love, because it was the first time he had said it aloud, not implied, not hidden behind duty. She reached for his hand, their fingers interlaced, the contact warm even through cold air and gloves. "I don't know how to be loved without waiting for it to vanish," she confessed softly. Samuel's thumb brushed over her knuckles in a slow, careful motion that felt like a vow. "Then we'll learn," he said, "one day at a time. I don't want to be the kind of man who promises and disappears." Margaret's voice trembled. "And I don't want to be the kind of woman who refuses happiness because she thinks she hasn't earned it." He leaned closer, not to take, not to claim, but to rest his forehead gently against hers, just as he had before, as if that simple closeness could hold the whole world steady. "You earned it the moment you kept going," he whispered. The lantern light flickered across their faces, painting their breath in silver. In the distance, a hymn began, quiet voices rising into the winter night, imperfect and sincere. Margaret closed her eyes. She felt the steady warmth of Samuel's presence. She heard Elsie's laughter. She smelled pine and smoke and something that felt like hope given a name. When she opened her eyes again, she looked at the Christmas tree standing in the square, humble, persistent, lit from within by small flames protected by glass. She realized she had been wrong all those years. Christmas was not a reminder of what had been taken. It was a reminder that even in the harshest winter, warmth could be chosen. Samuel drew back just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes were soft, the grief still there but no longer alone. "Married before Christmas?" he asked, a faint smile finally breaking through. Margaret laughed softly through tears she did not hide. "Yes," she whispered, "before Christmas." Elsie ran back to them, cheeks flushed, hair dusted with snow. She grabbed both their hands as if stitching them together. "Come see the tree," she insisted. Margaret and Samuel followed her into the lantern glow, their hands joined, their footsteps steady in the snow. And as Red Willow's winter night wrapped around them, cold, vast and unyielding, Margaret felt something she had not felt in years settle into her chest like a flame that would not go out, not survival, not endurance, love, a love they had earned, fought for, and finally claimed in the open, where no whisper could reach it anymore. 7 years had passed since the snowstorm that changed everything in Red Willow. Time had not erased the memory of it, the night the widow and the rancher stood together against the world, but it had softened its edges, turning it into the kind of story the townsfolk spoke of quietly, with a trace of reverence. The town itself had grown. The church had been rebuilt with taller windows that let the morning light pour through like grace. The general store had doubled in size, and where the old boarding house once stood, there was now a modest schoolhouse, its bell ringing every morning in the clear Wyoming air. The ranch beyond the river was still Samuel Crowe's, though it no longer looked as lonely as it once had. The fences stretched farther, the barns stood stronger, and laughter, steady, familiar laughter, carried through the fields like birdsong in spring. Margaret Crowe stood on the porch of the ranch house, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, watching her sons chase each other across the yard. 2 boys, dark-haired and quick-footed, born 3 winters apart, their shouts echoing through the late afternoon. They had Samuel's eyes and her stubbornness, and in them she saw proof that love, once given space to live, could build an entire world from nothing. Inside, the warmth of the fire reached into every corner of the home. Elsie, now 12, sat by the table, helping her father mend a broken saddle strap. She was taller, her hair longer, her laughter still bright, though she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from being raised in a house where truth and tenderness were the only laws that mattered. Samuel watched her with the same steady pride that had once carried him through hardship. His hands were still rough, his face more lined now, streaked with silver at the temples. But the wear of time suited him. He had aged like the land itself, weathered, unyielding, beautiful in its endurance. "Your stitching's too tight," he said gently. Elsie smiled, teasing. "Mama says that's because I don't know when to let go." He chuckled softly. "She's not wrong." From the doorway, Margaret smiled as she listened. That sound, his laughter, was still her favorite melody. Time had not dulled it. If anything, it carried more warmth now, more life. She walked toward them, resting a hand on Samuel's shoulder as she passed. His hand found hers without needing to look. That, too, had never changed. Dinner was simple: roasted vegetables, bread, and the stew that had become a family staple. But every shared meal still felt like a small miracle. Afterward, the boys clambered onto Samuel's knee, demanding a story from before Mama came. Samuel grinned. "Before Mama, the winters were longer, and the house was quieter," he said. "And your old man didn't know what to do with himself." Margaret swatted him playfully with a towel. "And after Mama..." He turned his gaze to her, eyes soft and full of that same quiet devotion that had survived 7 years of storms, births, losses, and the stubborn march of days. "After Mama," he said, "the house learned how to breathe again." Outside, the sky deepened into violet. Snow began to fall, slow, sparse flakes that glowed like embers in the lantern light. Samuel rose, stepping onto the porch, and Margaret followed, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "It's the first snow of the year," she murmured. "Always was your favorite," he said. "It used to frighten me," she admitted, her voice soft. "It reminded me of what I'd lost. But now..." She looked out at the falling white, her breath misting in the air. "Now it feels like a promise kept." Samuel reached for her hand. "We kept it together," he said simply, "even when it wasn't easy." She turned to him, smiling through the shimmer of unshed tears, especially when it wasn't easy. They stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the wind move gently through the pines, the faint sound of their children's laughter drifting through the open door. Red Willow had changed, but not entirely. Beatrice Harlan still lived on the far side of town, though her name was spoken now only in pity. Her brother Jedediah Pike had been found guilty of fraud 2 winters after the church hearing and was sent away in disgrace. Beatrice had refused to leave, perhaps believing that silence might one day make people forget, but it hadn't. Time had made her a ghost in her own house, a relic of a cruelty that no longer found an audience. The town itself had softened too. The Reverend spoke more of compassion than condemnation now. People lingered longer after services, sharing warmth instead of whispers. Some even credited Margaret for the change, though she never sought recognition. She and Samuel had simply lived, quietly and honestly, and sometimes that was enough to alter the fabric of a place. As the snow fell heavier, Margaret leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "Which one?" he said, his arm tightening around her. "The one when you came to my door," she said with a faint smile. "The storm, the lantern, the way everything began without either of us realizing it." He chuckled softly. "I remember thinking you looked at me like you were trying to decide if I was trouble or salvation." "I was right," she teased. "You were both." He turned toward her, his voice low. "And you were the only thing that made either one worth it." Her laughter faded into a quiet sigh. 7 years, she said softly. "It feels like both a heartbeat and a lifetime." Samuel brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering on her cheek. "Then let's keep earning it," he said. In the distance, the church bell began to toll, slow, deep, calling the town to the Christmas Eve service. The sound rolled across the snow like a benediction. Margaret smiled. "We should go. In a minute," he murmured. "Just one more moment here." The porch lantern flickered as the wind changed. The mountains loomed dark against the indigo sky. Inside, their children's voices rose in laughter, alive and bright, echoing through walls that had once known only silence. Margaret rested her head against Samuel's chest and closed her eyes. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear, the same heartbeat that had carried her through fear and into hope. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for happiness to vanish. It was here, built with her own hands, held in the warmth of the man beside her and the sound of their children's laughter. The snow fell heavier, softening the edges of the world. Samuel kissed her temple, the gesture tender and sure. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," he whispered. She smiled, her eyes shining. "Merry Christmas, Samuel." And as the world turned quiet around them once more, the lights of red willow glowed through the snow, steady and golden. A reminder that some loves do not fade with time. They deepen, they weather, and they remain. In that small corner of the world, beneath the eternal hush of winter, love had outlasted the storm. And it would keep burning, as constant as the fire that first brought them together. Every story leaves behind an echo, and the Christmas they earned is one that reminds us of the quiet strength found in forgiveness, the courage it takes to begin again, and the kind of love that doesn't arrive with grand gestures, but grows gently through loyalty, truth, and time. Margaret and Samuel's journey shows that even after the harshest winters, warmth can return, not by miracle, but by choice. It teaches us that home is not a place, but a person, that redemption often hides inside small acts of kindness, and that the bravest thing a heart can do is to stay open after being broken. If this story touched you, if it made you believe again in second chances, or reminded you that love can heal what the world once tried to destroy, tell us in the comments what it meant to you. And to let me know you were here until the very end, write the word lantern below. Because just like Margaret's light in the storm, your presence keeps this channel glowing. If you'd like to support the team that makes these heartfelt period romances possible, you can send us super thanks on YouTube with any amount you wish. Every gesture helps us continue bringing more stories like this one to life. And if you can't contribute that way, sharing this video with friends who love emotional romantic historical tales is another beautiful way to help us grow. Stay with us by watching the other stories linked in the cards above, each one filled with emotion, redemption, and timeless love. Thank you for being part of this journey through words, hearts, and history, because every story we tell, and every listener who stays until the last line keeps the lantern burning just a little longer.